The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting a dim glow over the cold hospital corridor. The air smelled of antiseptic and illness, a mix of sterile chemicals and the faint scent of despair. Sabrina Al-Haddad sat hunched over on a hard plastic chair, her thin fingers wrapped around the fragile hand of her 5-year-old son, Amir. His small body lay motionless on the hospital bed, the pale sheets barely rising and falling with his shallow breaths. Her heart clenched as she studied his face. His once rosy cheeks were now sunken, his skin pallid, his lips dry. He looked so fragile, so unlike the energetic boy who used to run around their tiny apartment, giggling at the smallest things. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She had to be strong for him. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Dr. Mahmoud, Amir's physician, entered with a heavy expression. Sabrina's stomach dropped. She had seen that look before, and it never brought good news. She stood abruptly. "Doctor, please. Tell me there's something we can do. Anything." Dr. Mahmoud sighed, glancing at Amir before meeting her gaze. "Mrs. Al-Haddad, we've done everything we can with the resources available. But his condition is worsening. The only real chance he has is a bone marrow transplant." Sabrina nodded frantically. "Okay, then let's do it. Where do I sign?" The doctor hesitated. "The procedure is expensive, and we've exhausted the hospital's charity fund. You still have an outstanding balance from the previous treatments. Without payment, the hospital cannot continue his care." Sabrina's breath hitched. "How much?" Dr. Mahmoud looked at the clipboard in his hands before answering. "At least $300,000 for the transplant, plus ongoing medical expenses." The world around her spun. $300,000. It might as well have been $3 million. She barely made enough to put food on the table, let alone pay for a life-saving procedure. "But you can't just stop treating him," she pleaded. Dr. Mahmoud's face softened. "I'm sorry, Sabrina. Truly am. But without payment, our hands are tied." Sabrina sank into the chair, her body trembling. She had no savings, no wealthy relatives, no assets to sell. She had already begged her landlord to give her more time on rent, and she was drowning in debt from previous hospital visits. She had tried everything. Well, there had to be a way. As if on cue, the door creaked open again, and a tall man entered. He was dressed in an expensive suit, but there was something sinister about him. His dark eyes scanned the room before settling on her. "Sabrina," he greeted smoothly. Her blood turned to ice. She knew this man. Faisal. A man whose name was whispered in the alleys of Beirut. A broker of desperation. He dealt in debts, in favors, in people. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Faisal's lips curved into a knowing smile. "I heard about your predicament." Sabrina's hands clenched into fists. "If you came to gloat, leave." "Oh no," Faisal chuckled. "I came with an opportunity. One that could solve all your problems." A sick feeling coiled in her stomach. She didn't need to ask to know where this was going. "There's a private auction," Faisal continued, stepping closer. "Exclusive. Wealthy men, powerful men, looking for companionship." Sabrina recoiled. "No." Faisal sighed, as if disappointed. "You should reconsider. The bidders are generous. A single night could fetch you hundreds of thousands." Sabrina shook her head violently. "I am not for sale." Faisal leaned in, lowering his voice. "No, but your son's life is." The words hit her like a physical blow. "I can't," her voice cracked. "You can," Faisal interrupted. "And you will." Sabrina's vision blurred. The weight of his words, of her situation, crushed her chest. She looked at Amir, at his tiny fingers curled against the sheets. He was all she had, and he was dying. Faisal must have sensed her hesitation because he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Be at this address tomorrow night." He placed the card on the nightstand. "Or say goodbye to your son." Then he left. Sabrina stared at the card, her hands shaking. This wasn't a choice. It was a death sentence, hers or Amir's. And she had no other option. The night air was thick with tension as Sabrina stood in front of a large, unmarked villa on the outskirts of Beirut. The building loomed over her, its towering iron gates silently daring her to turn back. A black-clad guard stood at the entrance, his muscular frame blocking the way as he scanned her from head to toe. She felt exposed. The dress they had forced her into clung to her body, the deep red silk a stark contrast to the modest clothing she usually wore. She hated the way it made her feel, like a prize wrapped for men to bid on. "Name?" the guard asked, his voice gruff. She swallowed hard. "Sabrina Al-Haddad." The guard tapped a device in his ear and listened for a response before stepping aside. Inside, her legs felt weak as she entered the grand hall, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The room was filled with an air of quiet decadence. Golden chandeliers cast a soft glow over velvet drapes, polished mahogany furniture, and the elegantly dressed men scattered across the space. They weren't ordinary men. They were powerful. Billionaires, oil tycoons, politicians. Men who could buy anything they desired. And tonight, their desire was her. A woman approached her, her eyes cold and calculating. She was older, draped in a deep emerald gown, her lips painted a sharp red. "You're number 17, the woman stated without emotion. "Stand here." Sabrina's body tensed as she was ushered behind a heavy crimson curtain. She wasn't alone. Other women stood there, their eyes filled with the same quiet terror she felt. The auction had already begun. Beyond the curtain, a man's voice boomed through the room, introducing each woman as if they were rare artifacts. Sabrina's stomach twisted as she listened. Number 12. A delicate beauty from Eastern Europe. Starting at $400,000. The sound of bids filled the air, numbers being thrown around as if they were nothing. Number 15. A fiery exotic from Morocco. 1 million. Sabrina squeezed her eyes shut. This was inhuman. A marketplace of flesh wrapped in luxury. Then her turn came. The curtain was pulled back, and the spotlight hit her like a scorching sun. She blinked against the brightness, her pulse pounding in her ears. "And now, gentlemen," the auctioneer announced with practiced charm. Number 17. A rare jewel from Lebanon, beauty with a mother's heart. A murmur ran through the room. She could feel their eyes devouring her. Sabrina fought the urge to run. "The bidding starts at $500,000. Silence. 600, a voice called out from the left. 800, another added. 1 million. The numbers climbed swiftly, each bid twisting a knife deeper into her dignity. Then a voice cut through the crowd, deep and commanding. $3 million. The room fell silent. Sabrina's breath hitched as she turned towards the source of the voice. A man sat at the back, his posture relaxed yet authoritative. He wore an impeccably tailored black suit, his chiseled features partially shadowed by the dim lighting. His hazel eyes, sharp and piercing, were locked onto her with an intensity that made her shiver. Khalid Al-Faiz. She recognized the name immediately. A billionaire from Saudi Arabia, one of the wealthiest men in the Middle East. A man of power, of influence. What was he doing here? The auctioneer cleared his throat. 3 million from Mr. Khalid Al-Faiz. Do I hear any higher bids? Silence. None of the other men dared challenge him. Sold. The gavel struck, sealing her fate. Sabrina felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. This was real. She had just been sold. She barely remembered being led away from the stage, her mind a blur as she was guided down a long, luxurious corridor. A door opened and she was ushered inside. The room was grand, furnished with plush seating, a mahogany bar, and a fireplace that crackled softly in the corner. But her eyes locked onto the man standing near the window, his back turned to her. Khalid. He turned slowly, his gaze assessing. Now that she was closer, she could see the sharpness of his features, the strong jawline, the slight stubble on his face, the quiet authority in his presence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he broke the silence. "Do you know who I am?" Sabrina clenched her fists. "You're Khalid Al-Fayez." A slight smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "Good. Then you know that I am not a man who wastes time." She stiffened. "What do you want from me?" Khalid tilted his head slightly. "You tell me." She frowned. "I didn't have a choice." His expression darkened slightly, though his voice remained calm. "No, you didn't." Anger flared in her chest. "Then why are you asking?" He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Because I want to know what kind of woman you are." Sabrina swallowed hard. The kind who would do anything to save her son. Something flickered in Khalid's eyes. Something unreadable. He studied her for a moment longer before walking to a nearby table. He picked up a folder and tossed it onto the seat between them. She hesitated before reaching for it. Her hands trembled as she flipped it open. Her breath caught. It was Amir's medical records. She looked up at him in shock. "How?" "I had your son's case reviewed by my personal doctors," Khalid said simply. "His transplant is already being arranged." Tears burned her eyes. "You what?" Khalid leaned back, watching her reaction. "Amir will receive the best care. You have my word." A sob built in her throat. She had sold herself to a stranger, expecting cruelty, expecting to be broken. Instead, she had been bought by a man who had already saved her son. She didn't know whether to fear him or fall to her knees in gratitude. Khalid's voice cut through her thoughts. "You belong to me now, Sabrina." Her heart pounded. What had she just signed herself into? Sabrina sat motionless, the weight of Khalid's words pressing down on her chest like an iron chain. "You belong to me now, Sabrina." The words echoed in her mind, filling her with a mixture of dread and confusion. She had braced herself for the worst. Humiliation, cruelty, perhaps even something far darker. But instead, she had been met with an unexpected reality. Khalid Al-Fayez had already taken control of Amir's treatment. Her son's life was no longer hanging by a thread. But at what cost? She looked up at Khalid, his sharp hazel eyes studying her with an intensity that made her shiver. He was an enigma, a man powerful enough to buy her with a single bid, yet seemingly uninterested in treating her like a mere possession. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Khalid leaned back against the leather armchair, his fingers tapping idly against the glass of whiskey he held. "Because I can." She stiffened. "That's not an answer." A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, but there was no humor in his eyes. "It's the only one that matters." Sabrina clenched her fists. "You bought me at an auction. What do you want from me?" "If you expect me to." "I expect you to do nothing," he interrupted, his voice firm. "Except listen." She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. Khalid set down his glass and stood, his towering frame making her feel even smaller than she already did. He walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling city lights of Beirut before turning back to her. "You were never meant to be at that auction, Sabrina." Her breath hitched. "What?" He folded his arms, his expression unreadable. "You were desperate. Someone took advantage of that and put you on that stage. But I don't deal in broken women. I don't buy what doesn't belong for sale." A lump formed in her throat. "Then why did you bid on me?" Khalid's gaze darkened. "Because I wasn't going to let someone else have you." Sabrina's body tensed. The way he said it sent a shiver down her spine, not out of fear but something else. Something she didn't want to name. She shook her head. "I don't understand. If you didn't want me, why?" "I didn't say I didn't want you." His voice was quiet, but the weight of it settled deep inside her. Sabrina's heart pounded. Khalid took a slow step toward her, closing the space between them. "I saved you from that auction, Sabrina. But make no mistake, you are mine now. You owe me." Her stomach twisted. Course, there was always a price. And what exactly do I owe you? She asked, forcing herself to hold his gaze. Khalid reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He tossed it onto the table between them. She hesitated before picking it up. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Plane ticket. First class. Unway. To Riyadh, she whispered. Khalid nodded. You leave with me tonight. Panic surged through her. No, I can't just leave. Amir. We'll be waiting for you there. She blinked in shock. You already moved him. Khalid's expression remained unreadable. He was transported to one of the best private hospitals in Saudi Arabia this morning. By the time you land, he will be under the care of specialists. Sabrina's hands trembled. He had planned this before the auction even took place. You planned everything, she whispered. Khalid didn't deny it. I always plan everything. She shook her head. I don't understand. Why go through all this trouble for me? Something flickered in Khalid's eyes. Something deep, something she couldn't decipher. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. Because I see things in people that they don't see in themselves. Sabrina felt her breath hitch. His gaze was unwavering, stripping her bare in a way no man ever had. Then, just as quickly, he stepped back. His face once again a mask of indifference. You have two choices, Sabrina. He gestured toward the envelope. Come with me, and your son will have a future. Or walk away and watch him die. The coldness in his voice sent a chill through her. He wasn't threatening her. He was simply stating the truth. There was no real choice. She lowered her gaze, clutching the ticket tightly. I'll go, she whispered. A slow, satisfied smile curved Khalid's lips. Good. The private jet was unlike anything Sabrina had ever seen. The cabin was spacious, adorned with sleek leather seats and golden accents. She sat stiffly, staring out the window as the city lights of Beirut disappeared beneath them. Khalid sat across from her, watching her in silence. She finally turned to him. What happens now? Khalid studied her for a moment before answering. Now, you learn how to survive in my world. Sabrina's fingers tightened around the armrest. She had stepped into a game far bigger than she had ever imagined. And Khalid Al-Fayez was the one holding all the pieces. The flight to Riyadh felt like a dream or a nightmare. Sabrina wasn't sure which. The luxurious jet hummed softly as it cut through the clouds, its cabin filled with an eerie silence. Across from her, Khalid sat relaxed, legs crossed, sipping a glass of dark amber liquid. Every now and then, his hazel eyes would flick toward her, watching, assessing. Sabrina forced herself to focus on the view outside. It was vast, endless darkness, much like her future. When the plane touched down, she barely had time to process what was happening before she was whisked away into a waiting car. The city of Riyadh sprawled before her, a dazzling mix of modern skyscrapers and ancient traditions. But she barely saw any of it. Her mind was consumed with one thought, Amir. Where is my son? She demanded as the car moved through the quiet streets. Khalid sat beside her, calm as ever. He's safe. That's not an answer, she snapped. His gaze darkened slightly. I don't give unnecessary details, Sabrina. You'll see him when the time is right. Her hands clenched into fists. You had no right to take him before telling me. Khalid turned to her fully, his expression unreadable. And if I had told you, would you have refused? She opened her mouth, then shut it. Of course she wouldn't have refused. She would have done anything to get Amir the medical care he needed. And Khalid knew it. You're cruel, she whispered. Khalid's lips twitched, but there was no humor in them. Cruel. Well, efficient. The car turned down a long private road, flanked by palm trees and high walls. Within moments, they arrived at a massive estate, larger than any home she had ever seen. It was a palace, pure and simple. Sabrina barely had time to take it in before the door was opened for her. A cold breeze hit her as she stepped out, her heart pounding. Servants stood in neat rows, waiting. The grand entrance doors were flung open, revealing an interior of marble floors, chandeliers, and gold-trimmed walls. She turned to Khalid. "Why am I here?" "You belong to me," he said simply. A shiver ran down her spine. "I never agreed to be yours," she said, her voice firm despite the fear creeping in. Khalid's jaw tightened. "Did you agree to let your son die?" Sabrina flinched. Whoa, that was a low blow. He didn't wait for her response. Instead, he nodded toward the house. "Come inside." She hesitated, then forced her legs to move. The doors shut behind her with a soft but final click. She was trapped. Her new home was unlike anything she had ever imagined. The ceilings stretched high, adorned with intricate designs. Massive chandeliers hung above, their crystals reflecting golden light. Every inch of the space screamed wealth, power, and something else, control. The walls were beautiful, but they were still walls. A cage, no matter how gilded, was still a cage. A maid approached her. "Madam, your room is ready." "Madam." Sabrina felt a strange sensation in her chest. She wasn't his wife. She wasn't even his mistress. She was, what? Possession. A debt to be repaid. She turned to Khalid. "And if I refuse?" His lips curled slightly. "You won't." Her pulse raced. The sheer confidence in his voice made her uneasy. He wasn't asking her to stay. He had already decided she would. Sabrina drew in a shaky breath before following the maid. Her room, if it could even be called that, was as extravagant as the rest of the house. A massive bed, silk sheets, a balcony overlooking a pristine garden. But all she could see were the locks on the doors. "Do I have a phone?" she asked suddenly. The maid hesitated. "Mr. Khalid said." "Of course he did," Sabrina muttered bitterly. She wasn't surprised. A man like Khalid wouldn't let her have access to the outside world so easily. She turned away, her heart aching. She had willingly walked into this, hadn't she? For Amir. Everything was for Amir. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She turned to see Khalid leaning against the doorway, watching her. "You look like a frightened animal," he mused. He scowled. "I'm not frightened." He raised an eyebrow. "No." She clenched her fists. "What do you want, Khalid?" He stepped inside, his presence overwhelming the room. "To remind you of the rules." "Rules?" she echoed. His gaze hardened. "You don't leave the estate without my permission. You don't speak to anyone outside without my knowledge. And most importantly, you don't forget why you're here." Sabrina's throat tightened. She wasn't a guest. She was a prisoner. She squared her shoulders. "And if I break your rules?" Khalid took another step forward. "Then I'll remind you why I make them." A shiver ran down her spine. He wasn't threatening her with violence. No, his methods were far more refined than that. He was a man who controlled the world with a single command. If she disobeyed, he wouldn't need to hurt her. He could hurt Amir instead. Sabrina swallowed hard. "You don't need to threaten me. I'll follow your rules." Khalid tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Good." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Sabrina froze. His touch was gentle, almost intimate. And that terrified her more than anything else. "Get some rest," he said softly. Then he turned and left, closing the door behind him. Sabrina exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to her chest. Her heart was pounding, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. And she didn't know how to stop it. Sabrina awoke to the sound of birds chirping beyond the grand balcony. For a moment she forgot where she was. The silk sheets, the massive bed, the intricate golden patterns on the ceiling, it was too luxurious, too foreign. Then reality crashed down on her. She was in his world now. A golden cage, no matter how opulent, was still a cage. The previous night replayed in her mind. Khalid's words, his touch. A simple gesture of tucking her hair behind her ear, yet it had left her shaken in a way she didn't want to admit. He was dangerous, but not in the way she had feared. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't violent. He was controlled, calculated, and somehow that made him even more terrifying. A knock at the door made her jolt upright. "Madam, breakfast is ready," a soft voice called from behind the door. Sabrina hesitated before swinging her legs over the side of the bed. She hadn't eaten much the day before, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. But it wasn't just food she needed. It was information. She needed to understand what Khalid really wanted from her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself before heading downstairs. The dining hall was large enough to host a royal banquet. A long table stretched down the middle, adorned with silverware and plates of food she barely recognized. Fruits, pastries, exotic cheeses, things she had only ever seen in magazines. And at the head of the table sat him, Khalid Alfiz, dressed in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal strong forearms. He looked like he belonged in a Forbes magazine, effortlessly powerful and in control. "Good morning," he greeted without looking up from his tablet. Sabrina hesitated before taking a seat, keeping her distance. "You could have let me eat in my room," she muttered. Khalid finally looked up, his hazel eyes piercing. "And let you pretend you're alone. Well, you need to get used to my presence." She bristled. "I don't need to get used to anything. I'm only here because of Amir." His gaze darkened slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gestured toward the food. "Eat." Sabrina hesitated before finally picking up a fork. She took a cautious bite of a croissant, and to her frustration, it was the best thing she had ever tasted. Minutes passed in silence. Khalid seemed engrossed in whatever was on his screen, barely acknowledging her. She should have been relieved. Instead, she found herself watching him. His sharp jawline, the way his fingers tapped idly against the table, the occasional furrow of his brows when he read something particularly serious. He was a man used to control, used to getting what he wanted. But what did he want from her? Sabrina set down her fork. "Tell me the truth, Khalid." He glanced at her, unimpressed. "About what? Why am I really here?" she pressed. "You say I belong to you, but you haven't asked me for anything. If you wanted a mistress, you would have made a move by now. If you wanted a servant, you wouldn't have put me in a palace. So what do you want?" Khalid exhaled, setting down his tablet. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "You're right," he admitted. "If I wanted you in my bed, you'd already be there. If I wanted to humiliate you, I wouldn't have gone through the trouble of buying your freedom." Sabrina's stomach twisted. "Then why?" Khalid studied her for a moment before answering. "Because I want to see if you're strong enough to survive in my world." She blinked. "What?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter but no less intense. "You think I saved you out of pity? That I'm some noble man who couldn't stand to see a mother in distress?" A smirk ghosted over his lips. "I don't do things out of kindness, Sabrina." She swallowed hard. "Then why?" His hazel eyes burned into hers. "Because I see something in you. Strength, defiance. A woman who refuses to break, even when the world tries to crush her." Sabrina's breath caught in her throat. "You were desperate enough to sell yourself to save your son," Khalid continued. "That kind of desperation can destroy a person, or it can turn them into something else." She shook her head. "I don't understand." Khalid exhaled, as if weighing his words carefully. My world is ruthless, Sabrina. Power is everything. I need someone by my side who understands that. Someone who knows what it's like to fight for survival. He froze. By your side. His gaze was unreadable. I don't want a fragile woman who will shatter the moment things get difficult. I want someone who can stand beside me without fear. Sabrina's mind reeled. Was this a test? Had he brought her here not as a possession, but as something else? A partner. She looked at him warily. And what if I don't want to be part of your world? Khalid's lips curled slightly. Then you'll spend the rest of your life hiding from it. Her stomach tightened. She thought about Amir, her sweet, innocent boy who deserved a future. She thought about the world Khalid spoke of. A world of power, danger, and survival. Could she survive in it? Did she even have a choice? Silence stretched between them. Finally, Khalid stood. Take today to think, he said. But remember, Sabrina, weakness is a choice. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Sabrina sat there, staring at the untouched food in front of her. Something told her that this was only the beginning, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next. Sabrina sat in silence long after Khalid had left. His words lingered in the air like an invisible chain around her neck. Weakness is a choice. It was a statement, not a question. Challenge, not an offer. Khalid didn't simply want obedience. He wanted her transformation. He wanted her to become something else, someone else. But could she? She had fought her entire life to survive, but that didn't mean she belonged in his world of power, wealth, and ruthless ambition. Then again, she had never belonged anywhere before. With a deep breath, she pushed her chair back and rose to her feet. Her decision wouldn't be made here, in the golden prison of a dining hall. She needed answers. She needed to see Amir.
The
mansion was vast, but every hallway seemed to lead nowhere. Sabrina wandered through the opulent corridors, her heart pounding with frustration. She had asked the staff about Amir, but they had only bowed their heads, offering no real answers. It was infuriating. Finally, she spotted a familiar figure at the end of a hallway. Latif, she called. Khalid's personal aide turned toward her, his expression as unreadable as ever. Madam, he greeted, inclining his head. Sabrina wasted no time. Where is Amir? Latif hesitated before answering. The young master is being well cared for, madam. That's not an answer. Latif exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. Mr. Khalid has instructed that you will see him once you've... Once I've what? She snapped. Latif hesitated. Once you've accepted your place here. Sabrina's stomach twisted. This is a game to him, isn't it? Latif's expression didn't change. Mr. Khalid does not play games, madam. He makes investments. The words sent a chill down her spine. Her fists clenched. Tell Khalid if he wants me to stay in this gilded cage. He better let me see my son. Otherwise, I'll tear this place apart until I find him myself. Latif blinked, as if surprised by her defiance. Then, to her shock, his lips twitched ever so slightly. I will inform Mr. Khalid of your request, he said. Sabrina's pulse hammered in her ears as she watched him walk away. She had played her card. Now she had to wait for Khalid's move. Night fell, and with it came a knock at her door. Sabrina's heart leapt. She opened it to find Khalid standing there, dressed in a dark button-down, sleeves once again rolled up to his forearms. He exuded quiet power, the kind that didn't need to be announced. Come with me, he said simply. Sabrina didn't hesitate. She followed him down the long hallways, past grand staircases and towering windows that overlooked the endless desert. Finally, they reached a large wooden door. Khalid pushed it open, revealing a room filled with soft golden lighting. And there on a plush bed lay Amir. Tears filled Sabrina's eyes as she rushed forward. Amir! Her son stirred, his little face scrunching before he blinked up at her. Mommy! A sob tore from her throat as she gathered him in her arms, holding him tightly. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here. He felt warm, safe. But as she held him, she felt the weight of Khalid's presence behind her. She turned to face him. You kept him from me. Khalid's expression was unreadable. I needed to know how far you'd go to see him. Fury surged through her. You had no right. His hazel eyes darkened. I had every right, Sabrina. You signed that away when you accepted my protection. Her hands tightened around Amir. He's not a bargaining chip. No, Khalid agreed, stepping closer. He's leverage. Her breath hitched. Khalid's gaze softened, just slightly. You are in my world now, Sabrina. And in my world, trust is earned. She hated him. And yet, as she looked at Amir, safe, cared for, she also understood him. Khalid wasn't a villain. He wasn't a savior either. He was something in between. A man who saw the world in transactions. And she had just become one. Sabrina exhaled shakily. What do you want from me, Khalid? His lips curved ever so slightly. I want you to thrive. A shiver ran down her spine. She had no idea what that meant. But she had a feeling she was about to find out.